Before we get to my favorite Firehair decks heading into the weekend, as well as everything else that's doing well in Marvel Snap right now, I'd like to remind everyone that Twitch drops return for Marvel Snap in March, starting at noon Central Time today. Drop by my live stream at twitch.tv/Jeff Hoagland or anybody else streaming Marvel Snap on Twitch over the course of the next week and watch for 6 hours to get 250 credits, some random boosters that are worthless, and a premium mystery variant that at least won't be a pixel. Let's go ahead and dive on into the deck list now, shall we? We kick off my Firehair deck recommendations with this Misery Thor's variation, of which there are many running around out in the wild. I actually really like this deck even before Firehair was added into the mix. Being able to go Thor into Beta Ray Bill, into Jane, into Misery, your hammers, and a 2 energy card on the last turn of the game would give you really big stats in 2 lanes. Firehair actually works really cleanly in this deck because this is one of the few Firehair decks where you don't need to draw her early because you can play her out alongside Misery and the hammers on turn 6 to get really big numbers. Firehair also adds a little bit of redundancy in this deck because if you do play her early, your final turn of the game can be Lady Deathstrike plus the hammers to go ahead and clean those out and double them up, which is typically enough to still win the game. As far as core must-have cards go in this deck, Beta Ray Bill, Misery, and Firehair are obviously non-negotiable higher series cards. They're adding a lot of key stats to the board. King Atiri, I think, is also absolutely necessary inside of these Thor's decks moving forward. He gives you redundancy for the games where Jane Foster is nowhere to be found. Our other handful of higher series cards, Red Guardian, Sam Wilson, and Miss Marvel, are just utility / tech cards and stats. So if they're missing from your collection, I think you could substitute them out for other things like Mobius and Mobius, Luke Cage, Shang-Chi, etc. that can interact with your opponent a little bit or add stats to the board and still have this deck operate at a pretty efficient level. The next Firehair deck I've been enjoying is a Surfer variation where she has a ton of utility and awesome things that you can double up for value in different spots. With Cassandra Nova and Venom, you can essentially get 2 big stat lines in different lanes against big decks like Arishem and Thanos. You can play Gwenpool on 4, and then you can play Firehair along with Venom or Deathlock on 5 to double her up. You can play your Silver Surfer out either early or late, and then use Venom or Deathlock as an absorbing man to get its effect twice over the course of the game. You could even Venom out your copies of Brood and the Broodlings in one lane to make Firehair spout Broodlings in her lane, kind of rearranging where those 3 energy cards are spread out over the course of the board. I also think this deck is pretty accessible in terms of which higher series cards that it needs. It's obviously built around Firehair, so she's non-negotiable, and then I would say Gwenpool is the other one that's important because she not only adds a lot of stats to the board, but she's also a pretty powerful effect for you to be doubling up with Firehair. Cassandra Nova is nice, but substitutable by another 3 energy card of your choosing, and Phastos is honestly a pet card I wanted to try in here, but honestly the deck's probably better if you cut him for your favorite other playable 3-drop that offers utility in a different way, as opposed to the inconsistency that Phastos himself is prone to. Likely unsurprised to anybody who's been following my channel since I returned to Marvel Snapping, my favorite Firehair variation is playing Victoria Hand. This core featuring Anti-Venom as well as Misery with Victoria is one that I was really enjoying before Firehair dropped, and she felt like a really natural inclusion in here since we wanted to be a Misery deck anyways. One of the things that Firehair has felt really good doing is the fact that Lady Deathstrike is a card that's felt this close to being playable in a number of metagames, I think including the existing one that we're in, and when she has added upside of letting you double up your own on reveals with Firehair, she feels really powerful in a lot of these deck lists. I will say one slot I'm a little bit skeptical on in this core is the White Tiger. She makes the top end of our curve feel a little bit clunky in the games where we don't have Anti-Venom, so it's very possible you could sub her out for another cheap card like Nico Minaru, for example, and have things run a little bit more smoothly. I will say this is definitely the least accessible of the 3 Firehair decks I'm showcasing today. Victoria Hand, Kate Bishop, Iron Patriot, Frigga, Anti-Venom, Misery. These are all pretty unique, powerful effects that don't have clean substitutions because they're depending on synergy with other cards in this deck to really bring the whole room together. Moving along to some non-Firehair decks I'd like to cover this week, we kick off our high potential category with an Agamotto Thanos matchup. For those who aren't familiar with my deck roundups, this high potential category is decks that have really promising stats on untap, but they have them in a very small sample size. They could easily be one of the next breakout things in our metagame, but it's also very possible their stats level off and become a bit more average as more people pick them up and start playing them as they're featured in highlight videos like this one. This particular deck list is basically a good stuff Thanos variation. It's got the typical mess of interactive tech cards, Mobius, Red Guardian, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, and even Alioth at the top end, along with Gorgon at the bottom to make sure you're disrupting whatever your opponent has going on. And then it just has hyper efficient numbers. Iron Patriot and Sam Wilson, two of the best 2-drops in the game. Cull Obsidian, really efficient 4 that works well with our Thanos stones. And then obviously Mockingbird and Thanos, the top end of the curve, along with Agamotto's spells mixed through the middle of it all to make sure you have powerful things to be doing at every spot in your curve. I think the only thing that stands out in my mind is maybe a small omission from this deck is it's surprising for me not to see King Aterian here, but I suppose there's also a possibility that because this deck doesn't have any way to clean up its location, perhaps adding him as a support on the board is a little bit too many slots to be taking up in addition to your Thanos stones. As far as higher series cards go in this deck list past Thanos and Agamotto, I would wager Mockingbird tends to be pretty important in terms of outputting efficient stats. Most of the rest of the cards here you could probably replace without losing too much. Remember, this deck is going to be absolutely massive, so replacing 1 or 2 cards with other substitutions isn't even going to impact that many of your games because the variance on what you're going to be drawing is much higher in a bigger Marvel Snap deck like this. Our next high potential deck list is a blast from the past with Annihilus Darkhawk putting up some stats this week. I would wager the success of this archetype is likely very related to the fact that ones like the Agamotto's Thanos variation that we showed a moment ago have been more popular alongside things like Arishem. Both Darkhawk and Cassandra Nova need fewer enablers to be absolutely massive with the wide variety of decks larger than 12 cards in Marvel Snap right now. This deck list is also leveraging Gorgon alongside the premier 2-drops as a proactive disruptive threat in the metagame as well that is quite good against all of the generated cards that are going around. One thing I'd be interested to know from any of you if you play it at home is, does 3 5 energy cards at the top end of this curve feel like a little bit much, with both Hawk, Annihilus, and Circe all clumping that up a little bit? I'd be concerned what your curves look like in some of the games where you draw a lot of those and not a lot of your stuff at the bottom. Speaking of Circe, I'd wager she's probably one of the higher series cards in this deck list that's more on the replaceable side. Its 2 namesakes, Darkhawk and Annihilus, are probably the only absolute must-haves here. Circe could substitute out for something like a Carnage or a Lady Deathstrike or a Viper that lets you clear things like Sentry's Void, but also provide utility. Iron Patriot and Sam Wilson, definitely some of the best 2 energy cards in the game, but they're not offering key synergies in this deck unlike some others, so you could probably swap them out for other things that you can play out early to get points on the board, such as a copy of Lizard. Our last high potential deck list is one we've seen around the fringe of the format for a while, and it's sweet to see it putting up some promising stats on untap, this Wong negative variation. One thing I like that this archetype has going for it is it has some really powerful draws that don't rely on Mr. Negative happening in order to put big numbers on the board. Essentially, you can set up Wong with the Mystique on the Wong and then make an absolutely massive Sage in that lane, and then Taskmaster it into another on that last turn of the game to let you have really big numbers without doing anything especially busted featuring Mr. Negative. That being said, this deck list is still playing Iron Man and Mystique along with Magic and Acceleration to have Mr. Negative happen early and even draw a bunch of the cards out with Jane Foster. So those really potent draws that always leave your opponent guessing how many stats you're going to be outputting are very much a possibility still as well. The handful of higher series cards in this deck list do tend to be fairly important. Ravonna Renslayer is a unique form of acceleration that's good with both your negative and non-negative draws. This is one of the few Sage decks where I wouldn't recommend you try and replace her with Wolfsbane because Sage's power does scale up quite larger when she's going to be one of your primary threats in the non-negative games. It's important she be as big as possible. Cassandra Nova makes your big deck matchup be a good bit more consistent, but her as well as Gora can probably substituted out for other things that you like inverting with Mr. Negative to give you stats in a pinch when your primary Sage Taskmaster game plan fails to come together for you. Moving along to our most popular and top performing category, one of our high potential callouts from last week has been picked up by a wider audience, and it has one of the highest play rates on Untapped for an individual 12 cards, while also maintaining its strong performance. This deck list is just a cluster of powerful disruptive elements in our current metagame. The combination of Gorgon and Mobius at the bottom end of your curve, as well as Sandman to add additional disruptive on that final turn of the game, alongside really efficient ways to spread stats out around the board with Miss Marvel and Doctor Doom, as well as Captain Marvel flying to help whichever lane needs it most, is really potent. This deck list, if you're looking to be proactive and disruptive while also having a dash of reaction in Shang-Chi when your opponent gets big stats out, this is probably the gross control deck that you want to have in your personal arsenal. As far as higher series cards go, Miss Marvel as well as Sam Wilson to enable her are probably the most important ones for this deck list. They're going to add efficient stats to the board, and Sam Wilson's shield helps meet Miss Marvel's condition of needing different costed cards spread out across everything else. The other higher series cards, Hydra Bob, Iron Patriot, Rocket and Groot, and Makari, can be substituted out for other 1, 2, and 3 energy cards. Just try and keep a diverse spread of energy costs, because Miss Marvel explicitly doesn't want you to have any duplicates for her to be turned on. Our next mix of popular and top performing decks is an Agamotto Good Stuff variation. I actually played this deck list a bunch on my live stream, and it gave me one of the easiest climbs I've had in Marvel Snap since coming back to it. If you want to see a highlight with that, be sure to check the link in the video description down below to my daily deck highlights channel, where I posted a feature of this one today. It's just exactly as the name implied, playing basically all of the best on-rate cards early in the curve, Kate, Iron Patriot, and Sam Wilson, while also playing some of the most potent disruptive cards in the center, Rocket and Groot, Juggernaut, and Shang-Chi, and then topping things off with Galacta and Gwenpool, which are really efficient ways to get stats on the board. Gwenpool in particular is worth calling out her notable synergy alongside Agamotto. She was explicitly updated to only impact character cards in Marvel Snap moving forward, so that means she explicitly dodges any spell cards in your hand, allowing you to concentrate the boost that she's giving to be less random, making it more likely that you play out all +6 that she's providing over the course of the game. This deck list is not remotely accessible. However, the 2-drops are really not replaceable here, because you need good, high-quality cards. The things you can substitute out are like the 3s and the 4s. For other utility cards, things like Luke Cage and Mobius could replace Copycat and Rocket and Groot for utility in different spots. But the top end of the curve, Agamotto himself, obviously, and then Galacta and Gwenpool are pretty important for providing stats consistently game to game in this core. Our next top performer is Scream. You should note that I've dropped the most popular tag as we move into this deck list, because despite consistently being at the tippy top in terms of performance, it just doesn't have a terribly high play rate in the metagame. I would wager that part of this is because it requires pretty specific higher series cards to be consistent. Most notably, Scream and Cannonball are pretty narrow these days, and this is essentially one of the only decks that both of those go in. However, if you picked up the recent big ticket bundle in the shop, this looks like to be the most efficient way to play those cards to get the most bang for the $100 that you've spent to acquire them. Finally, our last top performer is once again deck and discard. Depending on how you slice the data on Untapped, this is one of, if not the absolute best performing deck in the Untapped metrics right now. It's just really efficient at putting big numbers onto the board, and there isn't one single silver bullet tech card that shuts the entire thing down. If you're looking for a deck list that's flexible, fun, and puts up combo big numbers pretty consistently, I think this one is a great one to play if you have the cards that it needs. That being said, I would wager one of the reasons why this is only a top performing deck as opposed to a most popular one is because things like Frigga and Bullseye, which are incredibly niche along with Scorn, are absolutely necessary for this deck to function. Overall, I have to say I've really been enjoying playing with Firehair as a card. She's exactly the type of deck building puzzle that really makes the gears in my brain get turning and reminds me of the things that I love about Marvel Snap. That being said, looking at all of the metrics surrounding her, she also doesn't seem like she's an overly powerful card, which I think makes sense when you really think about it. Firehair is essentially a 3-card combo. You need an on reveal, you need a card to blow up that on reveal, and you need Firehair to all come together for her to really get to do her thing. That being said, I imagine she's going to be a staple in my Jeff's pick section on and off moving forward, because those decks are often built around doing something sweet, and Firehair really does that. I would love to hear what sweet things you've been doing in Marvel Snap in the comments down below. And remember, if you want to get some freebies, some credits, and a premium mystery variant, stop by twitch.tv/Jeff Hogan, where I'm going to be streaming absolutely all day on Friday. You can get all 6 hours of those Twitch drops done, and then I'll be streaming a bunch next week as well. You have plenty of time to get them done if you can't do them today. Don't worry about it. Hopefully we'll see you around real soon. I appreciate everybody that made it through the end of the video. Subscribe if you're new to the channel and you want more deck roundups like this one. Smash the like button if you enjoyed my work and want to help it reach some more people. I hope your next game of Marvel Snap is an excellent one, and don't go too mad getting Goliath inside of High Voltage.